A world divided, seeds of the Cold War. The Second World War ended in 1945, planting the seeds for the Cold War. The US and Soviet Union emerged as superpowers with clashing ideologies. The US valued individual freedom and economic liberty. The Soviet Union promoted communism and state control. This ideological clash fueled mistrust and suspicion. The Cold War had begun. At the heart of the Cold War lay a fundamental clash of ideologies: capitalism versus communism. The United States championed capitalism, a system that emphasized individual freedom, private property rights, and a free market economy. In the American view, capitalism, despite its inherent inequalities, offered individuals the opportunity to prosper through hard work and innovation. The U.S. Constitution, with its emphasis on individual rights and limited government, embodied these principles. In stark contrast, the Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, adhered to communism. This ideology, as interpreted by Stalin, called for the abolition of private property, the collectivization of resources, and a centrally planned economy. The Communist Party held absolute power, controlling all aspects of political, economic, and social life. The Soviet system, while claiming to strive for equality, suppressed individual freedoms and dissent in the name of the collective good. This ideological divide was irreconcilable and colored every aspect of the relationship between the two superpowers. The U.S. viewed the Soviet Union as a totalitarian state bent on exporting its communist revolution around the world. The Soviet Union, in turn, saw the U.S. as an imperialist power seeking to maintain its global dominance through capitalist exploitation. This ideological struggle played out on a global stage, with each superpower vying for influence in newly independent nations emerging from the ashes of colonialism. The clash between capitalism and communism was not merely an academic debate. It had real-world consequences, shaping the lives of millions and fueling proxy wars, espionage, and a relentless arms race. The ideological battle lines of the Cold War were drawn, setting the stage for decades of mistrust, rivalry, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. As World War II drew to a close, the Allied leaders Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met at two crucial conferences: Yalta in February 1945 and Potsdam in July-August 1945. The goal was to shape the post-war world. But these conferences, instead of forging lasting peace, exposed the growing tensions and mistrust between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The Yalta Conference, held in a Crimean resort town, aimed to determine the fate of post-war Europe. The Allied leaders agreed on the unconditional surrender of Germany, its division into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet, and the establishment of the United Nations as a forum for international cooperation. However, disagreements over the future of Poland highlighted the emerging East-West divide. Stalin, determined to install a communist government in Warsaw, made vague promises of free elections that were never fulfilled. The Potsdam Conference, held near Berlin just weeks after Germany's surrender, took place in a decidedly different atmosphere. Roosevelt had died, and President Truman, less trusting of Stalin, now led the U.S. delegation. The conference focused on the details of Germany's demilitarization, denazification, and reparations. However, disagreements over the economic future of Germany and the growing Soviet influence in Eastern Europe further strained relations. The Yalta and Potsdam conferences, intended to lay the groundwork for a peaceful post-war order, instead revealed the deep ideological divisions and geopolitical ambitions that would come to define the Cold War. The agreements reached at these conferences, often vague and open to interpretation, failed to bridge the growing chasm between East and West. The seeds of mistrust sown at Yalta and Potsdam would soon blossom into a full-fledged Cold War. Section 4. A Continent Divided, the Iron Curtain Descends. In the aftermath of World War II, Europe was divided by an Iron Curtain, a term coined by Winston Churchill. The Soviet Union installed communist regimes in Eastern Europe, creating a buffer zone against the West. These satellite states extended Soviet influence deep into Europe. Germany was defeated and divided into occupation zones. Berlin, within the Soviet zone, was also divided. The division of Germany became a permanent Cold War symbol. Millions were trapped behind the Iron Curtain, their freedoms curtailed. Families were divided, economies shattered, and the dream of unity distant. The Iron Curtain symbolized the Cold War's human cost and ideological divide. The division of Europe defined the Cold War, fueling tensions and crises. It served as a constant reminder of the fragility of peace in a polarized world. Section 5. Containing Communism, the Truman Doctrine, and the Marshall Plan. Faced with the growing Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, the United States, under the leadership of President Harry Truman, adopted a policy of containment. This policy, articulated in the Truman Doctrine of 1947, aimed to prevent the further spread of communism by providing economic and military aid to countries deemed vulnerable to Soviet pressure. The Truman Doctrine marked a decisive shift in American foreign policy, signaling its determination to resist Soviet expansionism wherever it might arise. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, was the economic cornerstone of containment. Named after Secretary of State George Marshall, this ambitious program provided billions of dollars in aid to war-torn European nations, including those within the Soviet sphere of influence. The Marshall Plan aimed to rebuild Europe's shattered economies, promote political stability, and create conditions unfavorable to the spread of communism. The Soviet Union, viewing the Marshall Plan as a thinly veiled attempt to undermine its influence in Eastern Europe, refused to participate and pressured its satellite states to do the same. Despite Soviet opposition, the Marshall Plan proved remarkably successful. Western Europe experienced an economic resurgence, strengthening its ties to the United States and demonstrating the benefits of capitalist democracy. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan represented a significant escalation of the Cold War, transforming the ideological struggle into a global contest for hearts and minds. The United States, through these initiatives, committed itself to containing communism, a commitment that would shape its foreign policy for decades to come and lead to interventions in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Section 6. Military Standoff, NATO, and the Warsaw Pact. The Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union was not confined to the realms of ideology and economics. It also manifested in a tense military standoff. In 1949, the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European nations formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a military alliance committed to collective defense. NATO's founding principle was simple: an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. This alliance, established in response to the perceived threat posed by the Soviet Union, solidified the division of Europe into two armed camps. The Soviet Union, viewing NATO as a direct threat to its security, responded in kind. In 1955, the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellites formed the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance designed to counter NATO. The Warsaw Pact formalized Soviet control over Eastern Europe and heightened the sense of military confrontation between East and West. The creation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact marked a dangerous new phase in the Cold War. Europe, once a battleground, now became a potential nuclear flashpoint. Both superpowers amassed vast arsenals of conventional and nuclear weapons, each side capable of inflicting unimaginable destruction on the other. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, emerged, a chilling recognition that any nuclear exchange would result in the annihilation of both sides. The military standoff between NATO and the Warsaw Pact cast a long shadow over the Cold War, fueling an arms race, heightening tensions, and creating a climate of fear and uncertainty that permeated all aspects of life. The world held its breath, aware that any miscalculation, any accident, could trigger a nuclear holocaust.